Data everywhere and not a drop to drink. It's a kind of a play on words from one of those famous phrases. But Gary, nowadays we are inundated with numbers being presented to the armchair fan when they're watching games, and certainly in house when we're working within the game. Have we reached a point where we are death by data?
We've reached a point where it's certainly not going away, is it? And it just seems to be so much more prevalent. I mean, look, we both benefited from the use of data. We've both seen how data can be massively important and massively, you know, it can shape the way you look at the game in certain ways. I do think that the challenge you've got at the moment is everybody's using data, aren't you? So if a fan wants to justify an argument on social media, he's going to use some data if he can get hold of it. You look at, um, the likes of Match of the Day or the sort of shows I would work on Sky. It's such a great visual. It's such a great way to back up an argument. And obviously everyone wants to be part of this sort of we're moving forward with data and we're using data kind of scenario. So yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's a like you say, it's borderline death by data. I think it depends on what data. I think that's always the key, and we've discussed this a lot. It's certain bits of data are important and they're great, but there's a lot of data that you can misuse. I think in certain contexts.
Yeah, I think when we were both starting out in the game, obviously you were a few years ahead as a player while I was off moonlighting in other sports. But certainly when I entered into football, I mean, the stats that were available or even used in house were really basic, weren't they? It was like number of passes attempted and completed, how many crosses you had, how many shots you had. And there wasn't an awful lot apart from that, really, was there?
When you say you was moonlighting, do you mean you were at university trying to avoid a job? Is that what you're
Yeah,
trying
well,
to
it
say?
was kind of like that. Yeah. Or yeah, just not working at all. Yeah, but yeah, rugby, cricket, but even cricket like always has been very stats heavy. But now we see really in football, it's moved away from those basic stats, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I remember. I suppose looking back to my first introduction to data, it's quite interesting because you look back so far ago, and actually, I think you were saying it the other day that we were chatting that you know people were literally writing down the amount of passes on a piece of paper in the stand. Like the apprentices would be tasked with, right, you've got to write how many passes that player makes, and you'd be sat there just going Roman. I don't know why we used to write in Roman numerals when we used to do something like that, but literally it'd be like one, what until you get to five, cross it up. Why don't you just write? It was crazy, wasn't it? But anyway, so
It's a
so
basic tally count, wasn't it, back in the day?
basic tally count. So I remember at Cambridge as an apprentice, I was 16, and everyone, of course, when you look back, the football was very direct. The football was, could have looked pretty archaic, but actually, in comparison to say a Wimbledon that were direct, Cambridge were direct, but they were based on statistics. There was a guy there who worked with John Beck called Neil Lanham. I think I've got his name right. And Neil was doing a lot of work with John on which stats were important in the game and which stats led to winning games. So they just purely went down a statistical model of how do we win games. So, in layman's terms, it was get the ball into these areas as quickly and accurately as you can. And that was John Beck called it Paradise Alley. So it was like the channel. It was like the channel of the pitch because he knew that crossing the ball would be more effective at creating chances than shooting from the outside of a box in the central area, for example. So he banned shots from outside the box. You'd get to the edge of the box a yard away, you'd be about to shoot, and the crowd would go, "Ooh, get excited," and you'd have to play it wide because a cross had a statistical better outcome than a shot from outside the box. I think we're going to come on to the Pomo position. So all
Yeah.
all of these things you had to cross as a winger to the far post because the far post had more. So it was all based on statistics. Now John at the time didn't really share loads. He'd share little bits, so he'd say why we were doing it and what he wants us to do, but he wouldn't really share the statistics because probably the players at the time would have, would have not struggled to comprehend it, but would have had no real understanding of it. But if I look back, that was like 34 years ago. A complete model from a data perspective that shaped the way a team played. So it's interesting about that. I mean, you had some experiences of doing that, didn't you? Because you used to, you've sort of back in the day, you delved into data yourself or had to do your own data on games, haven't you?
Yeah, well, it was literally that. When I was at London Irish playing rugby, Howard Amore, who was the club statistician as such, was doing exactly what you described the apprentices doing there. It was, you know, tally counts of number of rucks won, number of mauls won, line outs, and things like that. In rugby terms, they were the important stats, line breaks that you would make. And he was able to present those. And at the time, Clive Woodward had come in, who people may know took England to win the World Cup. And he was very much looking at the statistics around that. So when I came into football first in '98, so, again, we're time stamping this for everybody in terms of your age when you were 16. Well, obviously you were 16, but that was 34
There's
years ago.
people that hopefully there's listeners going, geez, I wasn't even born then. How old are these two?
Well, yeah, this is old, but this is history. And then came into football, and at the time, yeah, we were running the first kind of sports science department, and we were trying to use some analysis. So we were starting to video games and chop the games down into the component parts. So certainly the work I was doing for Norwich and for Ipswich, which was providing the managers and the coaches with what were videotapes at the time, but then also tally counts, number of crosses that were going in. But then we started to go a little bit more complex as to where were the crosses being delivered from and where were they being delivered to. So yeah, it wasn't just a case of we crossed it X amount of times, but was it a quite a shallow cross? Was it a deep cross? Was it going to near post, front post? Was it a pullback? And again, as you said there, yeah, you would start looking at effectiveness of shots. Where shots being taken from areas that were more likely to result in a goal, or were they less likely to score? So I think we started to see, yeah, probably there was a development certainly from what you mentioned there, where Charles Hughes, famous for his work with the FA and the development of POMO, which was the position of maximal opportunity. I think if I've got that right.
Correct.
Um, that used to be a mantra that was presented to coaches on coaching courses and certainly became, I suppose, it was the forerunner to what we call XG nowadays.
Yeah, it's true. It's so these things are not new, are they? They've become so much more refined and so much more. The operations are so much slicker in terms of how they're presented. Players, like we've spoke about before, players, fans, owners, stakeholders, everybody is aware of how important it is, and you only need a few pioneers within it, don't you? So, if you look at sort of in sport in general, you look at, kind of Moneyball and how that opened a lot of people's sort of eyes to how success could be generated. And then I suppose closer to home here, the two obvious cases are Brighton and Brentford, that have their own sort of, or their owners are based, have businesses within statistics or that use statistics and data modeling. And of course, they've done it to a certain degree very successfully. As a player, it was interesting as a player. I think I told the story about, sitting down with Steve McLaren, because Steve McLaren, as a coach at Derby at the time, we had Prozone in. We were one of the first clubs, I think, to use Prozone, and we had the big armchairs and used to sit in a big room full of these armchairs with a massive screen, and they'd show some stuff. So the Prozone predominantly at the time, if I'm right, I would imagine was mainly clips and a little bit of data, I would have thought. And you used to sit there before training and after training. Well, I used to try and get out of it all the time because these chairs, you'd sit for 20 minutes in like a massage chair before training. And before you'd get out there, like I had like two young kids at the time, and honestly, I'd be asleep. I'd be falling asleep in this chair. I'd be thinking, I don't want to try. I just want to go to bed. I don't want to train. So I didn't like it. I didn't enjoy it, but it was my first sort of foray into it. And I remember sitting down after a game against Man United once at Old Trafford, and Steve McLaren said, "Look, you know, look at your data. It's not," and it was obviously probably his first sort of view of it all. So I'm not suggesting everyone was using it correctly, but he'd say, "Look at your data. Look, it's not as good as Pallister and Bruce's," and I'd be thinking, "No shit, Sherlock." And he'd say like your pass completion is like 65%. I thought that was quite high. I thought must have had a good game there, and theirs was something like 85%. And I said, and that was my first thought of data can also be used very badly, because I thought to myself, well, I've got the ball, I'm under pressure. We've got very few options because we're away from home against a team far better than us. So, of course, you're going to give the ball away more because you're going to force more passes. Whereas their two centre backs at the time have got 5 or 6 players coming towards them. Everybody wants the ball. We're sat off in a sort of deeper shape, and they can complete as many passes as they want. They could have 100%. It's going to make no difference. So, you're comparing, essentially chalk with cheese. Do you know what I mean? I know it's not a very good saying, but I've just made it up. So, so you can use data very badly, and of course that was the early days, and like we said, it's become so much more. In fact, there's so much more of it now, isn't there? That's one of the things. Do you think there's too much? Are we in danger of having too much data or too many data providers within a club? What do you think?
Yeah, I think in terms of the data providers that we have nowadays, as you mentioned there, Prozone was one of those forerunners, wasn't it? It was a step forward in how we analyzed the game because we had the animations, we had far richer kind of physical data. You can track the players, but now we really do have an abundance of those service providers that are giving so much information to us now. It's actually like you have to be really careful to choose the kind of provider and maybe what their USP is. We see some people who provide really rich kind of technical statistics, so where you can now not just look at passes, but you can look at the type of passes and the origin of the passes and what the player was trying to do with it, can't you? It's not just a case of the player attempted, as Steve McLaren said to you, you had 64%. But what type of passes were you trying to play? Were they really incisive, difficult passes that, if successful, create really good goal scoring or attacking opportunities? Or is it something that you're quite weak at passing from, say, left to right or right to left or forward, whatever it might be? There's so much depth to the data now that every pass is weighed in almost in terms of its contribution to attacking and creating opportunities. Even a pass from a fullback to a centre back nowadays, if it then ends up creating a goal 10 passes later, it will have a weighting as to how successful and how much it contributed to potentially a goal. So I think when you look then at those companies or those service providers who are providing other kind of tactical related information. And one of those we've seen recently that we've been working with, Impact, are giving you far richer information as to not just the technicality of how the pass was completed or attempted, but also to where and how many players it influenced in the opposition. And that's becoming really exciting now. And it's really going to challenge coaches, isn't it?
Yeah, you mentioned impact. Little things like bypassed defenders. That pass that you can see how many players that you take out of the game with that one pass. So I really like that type of data because I spoke about the original stuff that I was sort of privy to. That every pass is deemed as the same type of pass. And you're measuring it as the same type of pass. Well, as we well know. I think there was one recently, and I can't remember who it was. I think it was a Barcelona player or one of the older Barcelona players, and he said, "If I make 100% pass completion, or if I have 95% pass completion, that probably means I've gone backwards and sideways all game and haven't done my job. So it's of no interest to me." And I think players and everyone's now looking for that extra little bit of context, which all the data providers, like you say, the likes of Impact, they're looking for just a bit more detail and a bit more a bit more context to what it is, because it has to be, doesn't it? The game is a fluid game. It's a game with so many nuances in it, but you can't just you know type in the data and come up with the answer. That there's so many different things to it. It's interesting, isn't it? Because for our listeners out there, I suppose it'd be good to give an idea of how, what we would get and how that would work. So, if I sort of come to the pre-game stuff first, and then you could do the in-game stuff as we're live. So pre-game, we would get, I'm right in saying we would get, well, you tell me the physical data that we would get pre-game now. If you're a championship club, what information would you get pre-game in terms of data?
Yeah, so all of the teams in the Premier League, in the Championship, and even now going down into some of the League One teams, we can now access all of the physical and technical data for all of the teams for every single game, and that includes the cup games now. So there's back in the day, you didn't know how hard another team would run or how they would last through games and the impact of their subs as they come on or as players go off. Whereas nowadays, we can model all of that. We can see exactly, for example, the next opponent, we could look at their last 6 games, we could look at their trends of how they perform physically in games that they win or they lose, home versus away, whether they're fast starters or late finishers, that they can make serious changes from the bench, which are going to effectively keep the pace of the game up. So you have to prepare in such a way for games that you're thinking about strategy. If they change their players with 25, 30 minutes to go, the pace of the game is going to go up. And that's now we're starting to see that affect some of the rotations of players in the game. So attacking players are going to be changed. If we know they're going to come on and they've got very high outputs, that they've got really good intensity, we might have to start thinking about changing fullbacks to allow them to be able to cope with this new threat that's coming onto the pitch. So we can certainly look back at however many games we want to and see how teams prepare. And that will cover everything from the distances they cover to how quickly they cover those distances, whether they're one of the teams who produces consistently high performances or potentially consistently low performances. And then off the back of that, we'll start to look at, for example, how long the ball is in play at certain grounds. So certain teams will try and minimize the amount of time that the ball is in play because it may suit their team better that the ball is in play for less time. Whereas other teams we know are going to keep the ball in play as long as possible because that suits their strengths. So that's some of the physical stuff that we would get certainly before the game.
And actually, we've seen quite a lot, haven't we? Where if you get a game where perhaps you're playing against a team that are really direct, and it's going to be a game. Let's say without mentioning sort of, well, I will mention names. Let's say we're playing away at Rotherham, and Steve Evans is a manager, and it's going to be a very, very physical game. I'm just using that as an example because that's been historically how it's worked.
Yeah.
Your data will be a lot lower in that game, won't it? Like the physical data will tend to be a lot lower. So, Sky could stick a stat up and everyone could go, oh, this is quite a low game. They're not running or they're not trying or they're not, but actually there's a lot more context to the type of game, isn't there? We found that. So that's pre-game. And then obviously in game, we've spoke, I think previously about the GPS. Well, quite interesting. We don't really tend to get very much technical information in game, do we? Why is that? I wonder. Why we don't really tend to get you've made this many passes, or I presume we can, but we don't
Well,
tend to use that, do we?
yeah, it's something that's coming live now and available to us. Is some of the service providers are going to provide that, or
Right.
are
Okay.
currently providing that. I think Catapult Match Tracker is one of those systems where essentially, as the data becomes available to you live, you can see those kind of counts going up. So, um, but what's been a real challenge now, not real challenge, but a real development is that data is live to everyone. It's not just available to us. So as these services are released, they're being released to the media at the same time. So
Right.
while you're
Right.
out at the edge of your technical area and you're trying to make, critical in-game decisions, you're trying to use feel and your ingenuity of understanding the game that's in front of you. Meanwhile, in the less pressurized press boxes or at home, people can actually see that data ticking over as it's going. So they already know how many passes that you've created. So, yeah, that is a real development now. But I suppose the question would be, even if you have that data, how would that potentially, as you as a head coach on the side, if you suddenly see certain stats, are you going to make the decision, or are you going to rely on your analysis department or your coaches or everyone working together to kind of influence?
Well, I think of course, you have to. I mean, I've always had this big view on data, but data supports, your naked eye. Data supports your. Now, some people have the opposite view and say data is what's actually happening in the game. Your naked eye and your view will simply just be your sort of objective view on that, or your subjective view on that. So I think it's a really interesting debate. I mean, look, maybe we'll get to the point where there are no coaches on the sideline, and they go. It was just a thought then, actually, because if someone believed in it so much, then maybe the data could be a more accurate predictor of what to do within the game. That's
Yeah,
good.
it doesn't tell you why the data is happening. It doesn't give you the context. It's just purely numbers, isn't it? So it's not telling you the game strategy that you're employing and the opposition employing and how they are playing off against each other.
No.
And also what your strategy was going into the game, because you might come into a game and you're going to expect to have 35% possession or 60% possession based on the team you're up against. And that provides you with different challenges, doesn't it? You're going against, I think we spoke about it in the previous podcast about going to Nottingham Forest and knowing that they struggled with high possession. It's almost like, we're not saying they were confused when they had the ball, but it provided different challenges when they were just left with the ball to do what they want or they need to do, as opposed to being put under pressure.
Yeah, I suppose what I was sort of getting at is many a coach's contextual view within the game is a bit wrong. so maybe data would be an interesting way of trying to see if a game could be controlled better. But anyway, we'll see if robot coach comes to the touchline anytime soon. We've probably got a few on there already.
Robo coach, I like
Robo
it.
coach,
Arnold
yeah.
Schwarzenegger as a robo coach.
There you go.
I'll be playing out from the back.
I might be. I like it. I might try and commission that for the film rights.
Yeah.
So yeah. I mean, so we've gone before the game. What sort of data we'd get? We've gone in game. What sort of data we will get and could get now, and that's really interesting. And then after a game, this is the bit that I always, very very quickly, put the sort of or the physical data aside, because again, we're sort of quite aware of that and we spoke about that quite a lot. But the technical data that you get after a game, I mean, sometimes, I would get emailed a report probably late Saturday night, maybe Sunday morning often by the analysis department. And sometimes that report could be 40 pages long. So it's 40 pages long. You're reading a report. It's really interesting. I think most people do the same. Well, most people like me do the same. I would imagine you'd probably look at it with a bit more detail, Dave. But I would look for the things that I want to see. I suppose you have to always be aware of there might be a bit of a bias there. But what I mean is, how much possession did we have? Who made those passes? Where did we make those passes? How many chances? So I used to always look at, okay, XG for, like shots for, shots against, shots on target for, shots on target against, all those key rich data that tend to be the big juicy ones that essentially tell you a lot about the game. And then you would tend to then drill down into what you want to see within that. Do you know what I mean? And what I always would do is, the analysis departments are great at giving you that 40-page report. And I'd always say the same, well, listen, look, you're the experts. Tell me what happened in the game. Tell me what patterns occurred in the game. Tell me what patterns occurred versus our previous, let's say at this stage of the season, I'd be saying, okay, we've played 7 games now. So tell me what patterns are coming up continually when we don't play well or when we do play well. And we know that good data isn't always going to correlate to winning a game. But I think over a period of time, if that data supports how you want to play and the metrics that you really want, because most managers or most head coaches or most teams and clubs should know if they play well, this is a rough idea of what that data will look like. The data follows the game plan, really, doesn't it? Or it should, if you've actioned it really well. So there's so much over one game. There's so much data, isn't there? There's 3 strands of data, and both physical and technical. Really, you say there's tactical data, but I suppose there is a little bit. And there's so many ways of looking at that, isn't there? How on earth do we digest all this data, and how do we contextualize it?
Well, I think that's why we've seen data analytics departments probably now come to the fore in football clubs, and they come under the kind of, they support a lot of different departments, don't they? They'll support the coaching, they'll support the analysts as such, even the physical performance departments, where they're there to crunch the numbers, aren't they? So I think most people now who've got a more than a passing interest in football are aware of things like XG and XGA, which for those people who've not heard of them before, it's kind of how threatening you are to score and effective at scoring, and the same for defending. But now I think those analytics departments are starting to look at trend analysis, and they're looking at how all of the numbers that are produced fit what is now becoming the club's game model as such, or even the coach's game model. Are you getting from your team what you expect? And also, are you getting from each game what you would expect? Because no matter what your game model is going to be, when you come up against a superior opponent, the likelihood is that they're going to be more effective at affecting their game model on the game than you are, because they'll probably be dominant. And really, that is part of the challenge as well, isn't it? It's when games collide where model meets model, and then it's right, predictive and analytics start to come out, don't they? So certainly the betting companies have become really strong at looking at the deeper levels of data in the game to be able to predict who is likely to come out of the game victorious, because they will have looked at previous matches, even between the coaches. It doesn't matter whether they're at the clubs they are now, how their models combine, the players, who's available, the weather conditions are also taken into account to, almost predict whether goalkeepers are stronger when it's dry versus in the rain, and so on and so forth. It's gone to a level now where certainly if your club isn't on top of it, people on the outside are on top of your club about it. They know
That's
more
great.
almost about how you play than you might do.
That's crazy. And I think it was you that told me that about betting companies have people that analyze the weather conditions, and if you get a penalty, that would massively affect the odds depending on the conditions and how effective that player is or the goalkeeper is within those conditions. It's absolutely bonkers, isn't it? How sort of detailed and enriched it's got. I mean, one thing that always, I suppose we're still at a level now, and when I'm doing sort of the media work on games, so we've got a live game and we're in the studio, and I suppose if you're someone like Sky Sports, for example, you can put, you have to put data as a visual, like so to show a context of how the game's going from a data perspective. Now it's always difficult, isn't it? Because you can't, I suppose, you can't get too detailed or you can't get too analytical because it's a game with thousands of people or millions of people watching it at home. So not everyone's going to want to see, such intricate detail. So a lot of it might be possession based or shots or whatever. And actually we've seen it with possession. Sometimes you can look at possession in a game and it can really not tell the whole story, can you? We're all a little bit guilty, aren't we? If one team, say, has had 70% possession, the other team's got 30, you automatically think the team with 70 is in complete control of the game and is by far the better team in the game. But actually, the other team at that point could be 2-0 up. And they're very good at not opening the game up, and the other team are very poor at breaking down a deep block. So, you've seen it a couple of times with the top teams who, in some ways, get away with it from a perception basis, like an Arsenal against Man City, where Arsenal are 1-0 up, and and I know they went down to 10 men at a point in the game, but they sat in, they defended probably they've got a striker 10 metres outside the box. So that's how deep they are. And you can imagine if we'd have done that, you would have been absolutely battered. But the point being, it's a club like Arsenal, and the way they're playing the game at that point to get a result will shape the data. Man City at that point, if you'd have put the last 10 minutes of that game in, it would have been 99% possession to Man City and 1% to Arsenal. But it doesn't necessarily tell the context of the scoreline or the game. So I think it's really interesting how we use data and where that will go next for the broadcasters. Because there's a thirst for more and more data, isn't there? But you still got to be understandable to people watching.
Yeah, I think when you watch the average game now, most people probably don't realize, as they just sit there watching the game, is the amount of information that is being presented to them throughout the game. I mean, obviously the score is in the top corner, but you will see other information being presented. Like, for example, in the Champions League, you will see the distances that a player covers or a team covers. Is every few minutes there is another stat being presented. It might be possession over the last 10 minutes, especially when it becomes really interesting, where I think when you mentioned there Arsenal Man City, it was like a crazy stat that they were presenting on where the game was being played. The action zones of the game are literally practically in Arsenal's penalty area or just outside it, where Man City are just recycling. But you're seeing there, like if a team like Arsenal are willing to go really deep block and say, well, okay, we're not going to have the ball and we're not going to even try and get the ball. We're not going to pressurize you. We're just going to make sure that we don't create any passing lanes for you to break through us, or we're not going to give you an opportunity to get a clear shot. We're going to work really hard to stop you doing what you like to do when you're Man City, which is getting into spaces. But I think going back to what you said about, Sky Sports News, I think if you watch your average cycle of an hour on Sky Sports News, practically every single story will have statistics and numbers attached to it. And it's only when you sit and you actually watch it how the whole story is, the whole show as such is relying on data and stats of whatever form, and they'll be constantly renewed and recycled and changed. They'll look at kind of news stories from different angles using almost the same game, the same stats, but from different points of view. I think that becomes where the kind of audience get to see, probably from drip feeding almost, that stats and data are, through the whole of sport nowadays.
And the interesting bit about that is, as a guest on those shows, you do your own research and you get sent the stats and you do your own look at stats and your own deep dive to find things that have a little bit more interest within the game, should you need to use it. And so actually really it's driving most of the conversation now. It's really, really interesting. I mean, without digressing too much, it's even changing the way that clubs recruit head coaches, isn't it? It's changing the way that clubs recruit players. Everything now is starting to go from the old good relationships with people. You take people's advice and people's recommendations to actually, and very much agent led to a certain degree, to now a lot of these things are now data led. I mean, I'm sure we could probably have another conversation about this. And certainly, we're chatting to different companies around what they do, aren't we? How they help clubs search for a head coach and how that data is used in that search. So it's fascinating where it's going, isn't it? And I suppose what you have to do is, as a practitioner within a club, is use which company you like the best, or use which style of data that you like the best. You mentioned impact earlier. I really like that because it just gives me a different flavour of what some of those passes feel like. I like that type of information, whereas someone else might like, a far more data driven information. Do you know what I mean? And obviously from your perspective, from a physical perspective, there'll be different companies that you like to use, or maybe you haven't got the choice. Maybe you just have to take on whoever the club have got at the time.
Yeah, or even who the league provides you with,
Yeah,
because not
yeah.
every club has got the resources to have a full data analytics department sat in the background. So it certainly becomes, what can we afford and what's available to us, and pick what you think is going to serve you in the best way. Certainly those at the top of the game will have access to all of the data sources and will be able to have departments that can deal with all of that. So,
Dave, quick
um,
question. Quick question. Sorry to interrupt you. So the software you would use. Let's say you're at Man United and you're at, let's say, Sutton United. Are the data providers trying to make it fair for not fair for everyone, but affordable for everyone, so that everybody can use data? Or are some of the companies want the top end clubs to be using it only because it's so expensive? What's the feeling amongst those providers? That, do you know what I mean, from a cost perspective? You haven't got to tell me the cost, but
yeah, I think for the main providers that are out there, they tend to go after league-wide deals. So they will discuss it with the Premier League or the Football League about provision across the league, and therefore the deal will be with the league, and the league will then almost split the cost across all of the clubs. However, they may also be looking at it as data enrichment now for the media or for promoting the sport across the globe. They want to have this information where they can talk about how effective the game is becoming, how much better the game is becoming. Now, the part of your challenge is, if you're in the Premier League and you have more resources, both financially and people and departments, is you will have an expectation of having more information, and you can get it in a more complex way. So, for example, if you're Sutton United, going back to them, they will have their GPS on the back of their shirts, which all the clubs will have now in the league, but they may not have what we spoke about earlier, having second spectrum cameras in the stadium. They may not have the infrastructure at the stadium to be able to house it,
yeah.
the internet speeds and the height of the stadium that they might need to be able to get the technology in. Excuse me. Whereas if you're at Manchester United or Arsenal, you might have even better sources of information than GPS. You'll be using systems like, there's one called Sportlight, which is LiDAR. So it's using um, laser mapping across a pitch. So the players don't need to wear anything now. These systems are, they're doing like 10,000 measurements per second. So the data is hugely accurate. Um, so yeah, that's on a whole different level. You can't afford for the league to provide that to every club because it's so expensive to do. But if you're talking about speed of information and accuracy of information, of course, the more money and the more resources you can have better than other teams. And that really comes down to the leagues will potentially provide you with a base level of service, which everybody gets, and then you choose whether you want to then spend more money on better or different or more sources.
Can you remember when we were at Derby? I can remember having a conversation at the time where there was talk of a lens in your shirt that would allow you. Remember the old player cam on
Yeah, yeah,
Sky? They don't do that anymore, do they? That player cam where it was almost like a lens in your shirt, but you'd be able to watch the game, from the perspective of Lionel Messi. And it was so interesting when you think about, God, where do you go next? Like, there's so many opportunities. We're talking about, I think they're changing the automated offsides, aren't they? I think they're working on a new system already. The system worked really well in the Euros, I thought, but yet we're deeming that as not quite good enough. And I think they've got a new system coming out. So it's going to take another year for us to test that out, where you think just the other one works, just get it out there. Let's use it. So it's such an evolving situation, all these different ways. I suppose, are we in danger of I suppose, look, it's advancement, isn't it? And it's evolvement, but are we in danger of just overloading our football departments with so much data that actually, I remember you having this conversation when we were at Millwall together, and you said we almost need somebody to control all the data and place it, because if you're not careful, you've got so much data coming in, but no real method of collating it all and using it all, and maybe having that historically.
Yeah, I think obviously what we were trying to do at Millwall was at a club that didn't really have that infrastructure in place. So how do we start to develop that for the club for the future? So you're trying to look at trends and what's coming and understand that if you don't start planning for the future, then for our future at that time at Millwall, while other clubs are doing it, we need to start doing it, because they've already got a competitive advantage in resource, but you need to probably think differently, or think differently than the clubs at your level about how you can try and have a competitive advantage. So that was whatever 4 or 5 years ago when we were starting to think about things like that. But yeah, I think players now have access to all this information. Like there's the famous story of Kevin De Bruyne using statistics and his data for part of his contract negotiation, because he could almost prove that of the very difficult types of passes that he would attempt and other players would attempt, he was more successful at completing them than nearly anybody else on the planet. In which case, his value to Man City or to anyone else was huge. So if players are now also investing in themselves to make sure that they have the video, the technical, the tactical information, as well as all of the physical stuff, they are their own corporations now. They're the CEO of themselves, and they're making sure that they have all this information. So there's pressure on you as a club to make sure that you're also ahead of that. How could it be that you'd have a player who's got more advanced systems than you have at the club? And probably clubs need to be aware of that. And it's going to certainly affect, if you're an established manager, you need to be thinking about all these new things that are coming on board, because certainly the younger head coaches are fully aware of them, aren't they? They are data savvy. They are all over the technology. So to keep up with the youth, we also have to be aware of what's coming, but also we can provide that extra layer of years and years and years on task.
Yeah, it's an interesting negotiation tactic as when you're going for a new contract, isn't it? I'm probably the best on the planet at passing the ball. There's not really much like, okay, so you basically want the most anyone's ever been paid ever anywhere at the moment. Yep, that's what I want. Okay, here you go. So, yeah, I don't think we've ever quite got to those levels yet. Yet, I'm saying.
Not yet. No, we're waiting for those, yeah.
We're waiting for it. But you're right. Because there's so much data available. We had this conversation with Matt Smith in our podcast. So if anyone hasn't listened to that podcast, it's well worth a listen, isn't it? It's a player that was aware of his own data, was aware of his own value to the team and how that looked from a sort of metric point of view. Like Matt would come in and say, every time I've started, we've scored more goals and we've won more games. And he wouldn't drill down into the exact numbers, but you knew that if I asked him or challenged him on it, he would. And often I would go away and actually look and go, do you know what? He's actually right. Or I think I said to Smudge around, I always felt that with someone like Matt in the team, because he perhaps wasn't as mobile and he was a different type of striker, but you would concede more goals because you couldn't press as effectively. But then you looked at the data, and sometimes the data didn't necessarily back that up. You actually conceded less goals because maybe you'd hit him a little bit earlier, so therefore the ball would be away from your goal a lot more often. I know it's a very simplistic view, but so players are definitely, like you say, players are going to get to the point where they're armed with the data, even if it's not from the club. They have their own data providers. They can offer context if you're leaving them out the team. So you can't avoid it. You can't just use your naked eye and give a player a reason anymore, because 9 times out of 10, maybe either now or in the future, that player is going to be as armed as your analyst department. And they're going to be able to. I know that's not an argument. It's still a debate over, but that's my decision, and you have a feeling. Data doesn't necessarily always provide the feeling and the context around the game sometimes. So you still have to navigate those situations. But certainly players are forewarned, because a lot of their agencies now, they'll use data as well. Everybody's
Absolutely.
using it. Everybody has their own sort of version of it. Everyone tries to have that argument. You're signing a player. Oh, this is why you should sign this player, because your team hasn't got this, and my player does X. Yeah, it's fascinating where it's going.
Well, we're even seeing it now. All of this data that we're talking about is live and it's available if you're willing to pay for a license as an armchair amateur, as a keyboard warrior, if you want to use that phrase. But, a fan on the outside now can dissect your game. There's
Wow.
one system that's available on Twitter or X where essentially no sooner will the game have been finished. I'm talking about 2 minutes after the game, the full analytics of your game are spat out by this
Wow.
bot,
Wow.
which will tell you, it will show you the passing maps. It will show you the rich data because it's being coded live. And okay, you could probably say that once it gets cleaned up a little bit later on, it'll be even better. But almost straight away, before you've even shook hands with your opposite number, the game report is out there, and you cannot now go to a press conference and try and pull the wool over everyone's eyes with some stat that you've chosen that's potentially usable by you, because already the fan base can log on to somebody who's broken the game down and say that actually isn't the case.
Do you think that's shaping the way? Do you think that's going to shape the way? Of course, most fans would go to the game, and they're there for the game experience, aren't they? They're there for the emotions of the game. They're there with their friends. They're there with their families. They're there because they've been there. They've been there for 20, 30 years, and it's part of their life and part of their family's life. So they're not going to watch the game from a data perspective. But it'd be interesting whether that shapes a lot of the argument after games now. From a fan perspective, a lot of the, again, you might be able to give me a bit more context, I don't know, but like on social media, for example, after a game, is the argument now around data? Is there a lot of data used in some of those fan interactions after games? Because we know that a head coach would come under pressure far quicker nowadays than you would previously. Is that shaped? Is some of that shaped around the data, or still the raw emotion, or a bit of both? Because the more information people have, the more they want to use it, don't they? In those debates.
Yeah, 100%. The fans, should they want to, can bring that in, and of course, nobody's trying to hide the data from anyone. It's not like we want to, squirrel it away and put a big wall around it. Um,
It'd be
but
nice.
again, well, yeah, it might be nice. But again, going back to what we said earlier, it doesn't necessarily give you the context of your game plan
No.
or what you thought the opposition game plan would be. It tells you in black and white some of the things around the game, and maybe it does provide some understanding of um, what an opponent maybe was doing to you, or what you were trying to do to the opponent. Um, but for those people who are just interested in numbers and stats, you can very quickly get caught up with the team has had 30% possession for 6 games this season. But in the end, if you've won 4 of them, at some stage it does also come down to effectiveness. And you're not judging everybody exactly the same, aren't you? There's probably a weighting for teams which have got better players, potentially more resources, versus teams that don't. You mentioned Rotherham earlier, but Rotherham generally in the championship, it's more of a challenge for Rotherham versus a team like, for example, West Brom, or Burnley this year, or Southampton, who would potentially have more resources, in which case, is it right that the the kind of stats that are produced at the end of the game and the data that's produced should be weighed equally? Maybe it isn't. Maybe that's up for the analysts to take that kind of context around club personnel manager into account, because certainly you will see some head coaches who far outperform the stats, don't they? And then you will see other people who have got unbelievable kind of metrics but don't get results.
No, and actually, it's quite funny, isn't it? Because we've had conversation with people before, and there is definitely, some coaches will be so aware of those stats and want those stats to look so impressive, and there's nothing wrong with that. You have to manage however you want to manage, but you genuinely see teams in games, don't you, where you see with two players 5 yards apart and they just pass it to each other. Honestly, they make like 20 passes. Well, if you start to look at that at the end of a game, let's say you've made 900 passes in a game, people would go, wow, that's incredible. That's incredible. It's incredible.
What a way of playing.
What a way of playing. They made, but actually there's times where, a lot of those passes will be absolutely pointless passes. So again, I think there's always context to it, because if you're not careful, rather than playing to a philosophy and trying to win the game, sometimes people will start playing to get data that they can justify this great model. And there's a fine line, isn't there? There's a fine line between it, but ultimately that is part of the game now. So if you're a young coach coming through, that is maybe something you want to make sure you tick that box. I've always felt as though, the responsibility as a manager, is twofold. It's, yes, of course, you want to play entertaining football. You want to score goals. You want to create chances. You want to create excitement. But you also have a responsibility to that club to win games of football. You can't avoid that. That's always felt to me like the biggest responsibility. And I know the game's changed a little bit, and I know the game's evolving and changing, and we all change with that. We all change our styles with that. But yeah, data's fascinating. I'm going to be really interesting to listen to hopefully one of our next podcasts with Impact, because I think that will give us an even look. We're trying to describe. You're doing a better job of describing data than I am, Dave. But I'm sure that the guys at Impact will probably be able to open people's eyes even further. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, that one's coming soon, and just looking at some of the stats that they produce here in front of me, it's you almost need a degree to understand some of the stuff that they're producing, but it's certainly fascinating. So yeah, tune in for that one when it comes up. But yeah, death by data, I think we've done it to death. So we'll leave it there, and tune in soon for the next Breaking Lines. Don't forget to follow, like, subscribe wherever you see it, and perhaps even give us a review and comments to any of our posts. We look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, guys.